Okay, good evening, everyone. Once again, welcome back to another episode of Mondays with Moshe on Monday night at 9 p.m. Thank you for joining. Wow, so many new faces this week. That's really exciting. And I also notice, just from the people who are just signing on, that there are, I believe, a number of second-generation Holocaust survivors. If we can, I mean, we're going to find out if we're allowed to call them that, if that's politically correct to call them second generation Holocaust survivors, or is only the first generation of the survivors. We'll find out more about that. But from Lakewood, New Jersey, all the way out to Melbourne, Australia, where we have with us tonight Dr. George Halasz, a member of the Orthodox community in Melbourne, Australia. Good afternoon, Dr. Halasz, George, and thanks for joining.
Thank you, Moshe. It's good afternoon to me here and good evening to you and everyone on the webcast tonight there. It's Monday night for you.
And I love, if you look at the right side of your screen, you can see the sun penetrating the window, which I think is just lovely. So we can get the sun here on the East Coast too. We just
because we're also, just to remind everyone, we're heading into summer here.
Right, of course, we knew that. Okay, so that should lighten things up for us. Well, thank you very much for joining, for agreeing to come on, and for this fabulous topic for tonight, which is the topic of intergenerational trauma. George, what do you have to do with intergenerational trauma? What do you have to do with Holocaust survivors? What's your profession? Tell us who you are.
Well, thank you. Firstly, thank you very much, Moshe, for inviting me and all the trouble you went to set up this evening's presentation. It's been a delight to meet you and chat with you in preparation. So my name's George Halasz. I was born in Budapest, Hungary in the late 40s after the Second World War. And both my parents are what qualify as Holocaust survivors. By training and profession, I then entered medicine here in Melbourne, Australia, and we came to Australia as refugees in 1957 after a revolution that was going through Hungary at the time in late 1956, obviously known as the Hungarian Revolution.
I'm doing a class that's important to me.
Oh.
I'm sorry?
No, somebody mistakenly unmuted themselves. Please keep yourself muted. And if for those of you who'd like to ask a question or comment, please raise your hand using the reactions button on the bottom right of your screen. I'll be happy to take your questions. But till then, please stay muted. Thanks.
Yes, so I then finished my schooling and medicine training here in Melbourne, Australia, or Melbourne, as you might say. Aussieland is the other name, by the way, for Australia, so I might refer to us as Aussies. And then afterwards, I went to the UK to train in psychiatry and child psychiatry in London at King's College and the Maudsley Hospitals. And
Is that where you picked up the accent, by the way? Was that in the UK?
Well, it depends on which accent, because I would then have a double accent. I've certainly got an Australian one, and people when I came home said, why do you have a plum in your mouth? And I said, what are you talking about? So I apparently did pick up an English accent as well, but I'm not sure which one you're hearing, Moshe, at the moment, or a combination, a hybrid. Anyway, so then I have been practicing for over 40 years in the profession of psychiatry and with a subspecialty of child psychiatry. And it occurred to me somewhere in my mid-career that while I knew an incredible amount of understanding and information about my patients who had upsetting and perhaps disrupted childhoods, I never quite attended to my own in the same depth. Now, part of that reason was because my family, both my mother and late father, were not inclined to speak too much about their childhood experiences, which was not uncommon, by the way. In the post-World War II period, many parents chose, for various reasons, to remain very reticent, very silent, or very minimalist. On the other extreme, there were some who actually couldn't stop talking and devoted their lives to commemorating everything joined Holocaust museums and so on. So there's a whole spectrum, but I came from the very silent sort of family. So in my mid-40s, when unfortunately my late father was starting to be affected by Alzheimer's, I realized that unless I invited them to tell me about what was going on, most of his memories were going to fade, and I would never have a chance to find out what actually they lived through, what he lived through. So in the mid to late 80s, I developed a great interest and videoed many visits to my mum and dad's place with the idea and the fact of gathering family history. Jump forward over a decade after my father passed away in the late 1990s, my mother was invited by the Shoah Foundation. This is the organization started by Steven Spielberg in the aftermath of his world famous and Academy Award-winning movie Schindler's List, to interview survivors from around the world, which became the Visual History Foundation. As in visual history, people were recorded, and it was a foundational movement where over 50,000 survivors were interviewed. Now, my mum, Alice Halasz, who's been my co-worker in this for the last 20 plus years, was one of those interviewees here in Melbourne. And based on that interview, which lasted for over 4 hours, I became very curious to find out the impact that her interview had on me. And so I merged my training in child psychiatry and child psychotherapy, infant observation, and the world of the mother and the baby with my own adult experiences with my mum. And what you're going to, I think, show shortly, Moshe, is what I developed with my mum is called a split screen. And what you'll see is on the split screen, the upper left-hand corner will be the image of my mum, and there'll be little 2-minute segments edited out from her 4-hour history. And on the bottom right will be my face as I listened and tried to absorb and hear and understand what she was going through in her narration. So this split screen became the, as it were, single case study, in depth, ongoing, and the subject just happens to be a mother and a son who happens to be my mother and me. But over the last 20 years or so, I've gone over with my mum, obviously, many times the information, the impact, and then I published on this. And so that, in summary, is how I came to be involved in researching the intergenerational trauma on the basis of a single case study informed by the professional literature and research in mother-infant attachment. In fact, Moshe, I yesterday looked through your past episodes when you interviewed Dan Hughes, and you used the expression, I think, now something about research children being, oh, there was a, I've written it, sat down somewhere, it'll come back to me, but a very cute twist of phrase about when children become the subjects of their parents' studies. You may,
you're not talking about intersubjectivity, are you? No.
Well, intersubjectivity is the experience, but if you just hold on for 1 second, because I wrote it down, it was so captivating. It was called guinea kids. You use the phrase.
Oh, guinea kids, yes.
Guinea kids, that's right.
Somebody appreciates my humor.
Yeah, well.
I have to go all the way down to Australia for someone to get a kick out of something I say.
Well, when Dan was saying that he was became involved in interest of attachment with his children, you retorted instantly, like on the spot, oh, guinea kids.
Guinea kids.
And I thought, wow, that's really nailing it. So I became a guinea kid, as it were, in my midlife
Well,
career.
I think there's multiple fascinating pieces. And as I'm listening to you talk about the way that this study was conducted, I mean, I think that we watching this tonight are going to be therapists kind of studying your reactions. You watching it initially, and then I'm sure reviewing it many times, is not only a therapist watching your reactions, so your therapeutic antenna are so attuned, but you're also your own self watching your own self. So you're subjective as the self, you're objective as a shrink, right? And
Yep.
there's just it's so multi-layered in that way.
Yes.
In terms of how the study is conducted. I think it's going to be fascinating for us to see. I'm wondering what might, besides, just the demonstration of it, I'm wondering what else might come out of having an audience of up to 900 mental health professionals watch this, and what insight might come out. That's putting aside the agenda itself.
Now, I think that's fascinating because the group, I assume, who watching tonight and sharing ideas will be also of other generations. Yes. And also direct or non-direct experiences of Holocaust. So those with lineage with Holocaust histories will be experiencing the same stimulus, as it were, quite differently from those who are one or many steps removed and not only, but let's say culturally sensitized rather than familial sensitized.
Absolutely. And I see that there are people on here who I'm assuming are children of Holocaust survivors. I'm going to guess Chana, whose video is on, is a child of a Holocaust survivor. I'm going to guess Chaya Danziger. Your video's not on now, but can I guess that you're a child of a Holocaust survivor? Get a thumbs up. And there's probably others, but those are just, the two on the top of my screen. So
now, could I just also invite everyone to please, before we start, to please take care of yourself while you're watching. The reason I say this is because of the experience of vicarious trauma. Now, just for those who aren't familiar with it, it's a universal experience. It's that when we're in the presence of listening or witnessing or engaging, both as directly as therapists or here we're as viewers, with a trauma story or narrative, some of it can be absorbed and put us a little bit out of sorts, especially if we're in our vulnerable state ourselves, as you are tonight, Monday night there. And so to please track your own well-being, and if you feel like not watching it, please don't watch after you feel distressed. And at the end, I think we'll just take a couple of moments, perhaps if I could just suggest, Moshe, that you ask for any questions before we go on, so we don't launch into whatever is the remaining of the time, because one of the metaphors I've learned over the years for engaging with this video, including for myself, when I watched it last night, the metaphor is one of scuba diving. And I don't know how many of you scuba dive, but there's one rule that in scuba diving, you never ever do it alone. And you always take care as you go down into the deep levels, and then take much care coming up to the surface. Because if you don't do that rhythm carefully, at least in scuba diving, the reality is you can get what's called the bends, which is a nasty condition. It can be not only painful, but very seriously threatening. And in a similar way, the brain, when we're engaged in deep trauma, tends to go into deep places. And I don't want to overthink or overanalyze this, but just as a general Band-Aid warning that we should take care as we come out and in the immediate few minutes afterwards, okay?
Okay, and I'll let you demonstrate how we do that. How about that?
Okay.
Okay.
I mean, the simple one rule is you can always take slow, deep breaths if you're feeling distressed. And that's what you do when you're diving as well. When you feel a little bit floundering, you just remind yourself, you've got your mouthpiece, just try and take a slow, deep breath in and slower letting it out. And that cycle resets the autonomic nervous system to calm as opposed to being in chaos.
Okay, so for those of you who just joined, we're about to start a 10 or 12-minute clip of Dr. George Halasz watching the interview of his mother. I believe he said her name is Helen.
Alice.
Alice. Oh, Alice Halasz,
Yep.
describing her experiences in the Holocaust. And we're watching the reactions of the child to the mother. And then we're going to have a discussion about that afterwards. So,
And also Alice sends her regards to everybody, by the way.
yeah. Regards
Can I ask, are there any graphic pictures or any videos that are going to be shown?
Both all audio and visual of my mother and myself, except the last 3 segments are mother babies for about a minute each.
Thank you.
Nothing graphic, no.
Changed over everything.
This is very good. And this is how I just saw it a couple of days ago at home.
And before Pesach, my father, darling father, went over everywhere and looked at the bread, what they have to do. And in the Seder, we had the whole big family together.
How many people?
Oh, about 10, 12. I'm just from, yeah.
Was it in your home that
Yes.
they had the Pesach?
Yes, yes.
Who prepared the meal?
With my darling mother.
Did you help?
No. I told you I'm not allowed to did anything. But I was watching and eating. I didn't like the gnadly, and I don't like. And I was starving in Pesach because that time I ate a lot of bread and I missed the bread.
Do you remember a Pesach night, and can you describe it for me with the family?
Yeah, I said the Manishtana, and before the.
I got very
before the
confused here
eating,
because I
it
knew
was
that
all
my
right,
mother had a
you know.
younger sister and I didn't understand how she was saying it.
But after
later she clarified
the
it.
meal, I didn't feel like it very much. But then my father, he was looking around and he saw, and then he made quicker. I remember, I never will forget. A very tall man, very handsome, came in, knocked in, and he told my father, "You are a spy, and you sending letters with galamb, the pigeon. Pigeon.
What is it in Hungarian, the word?
Galamb, pigeon. I think this who's flying. Pig.
Pilot?
No. I don't know. Anyway, you put that under the arm. I mean and you send it to pigeon. Yeah, thank you.
It feels like 20
And
questions.
then
What is
I told you earlier, my father was really very clever and he knows all the time what he had to do, but it was risky. He told us, please go outside to the family.
Alice, you were telling me about the journey from Monor to Auschwitz. Do you have any idea how many carriages there were on the train that you were on?
No, no idea. When we went down, I could see it, but probably I wasn't interested, but I don't know. It was quite a long one, that's for sure.
Who was guarding the train? What nationality were the guards?
I think that time it was mixed, Hungarian and German.
On the journey, do you remember anything that you discussed with your mother?
No, we didn't discuss anything.
That meeting?
I can't. I think that was the happiest minute in my life. You can imagine when I saw him and he saw me. But he knew I'm alive. He knew from the join, and he knew all the family. Nobody else are in the life in the family. But that was, I can't describe you that moment.
How did your father look?
Good. He was looking good, and I was so fat. and my late
I thought that
husband
this
was
so fat is
from
like an
Pesterzsébet, but
only
we
way
knew
to
each other
talk her
from the
emotionally.
school.
She is so filled.
He met my father in Pesterzsébet, and my father told him, I am alive. One day, it was exactly Friday, the social worker
This
from
is actually the reactivation of a separation memory of my late father.
What is the Jewish place? What is the name? Who's helping people?
Jewish welfare?
Welfare, yes. The social worker came and she said, I can't keep him anymore here. And I said, no way, I'm not giving up. And suddenly,
She sees separation
Saturday
as a
morning,
giving up.
he couldn't wake up. He was weak. He couldn't went to the toilet. And our doctor came over and he said, I would like to speak with George as well, two of them, because you can't keep him anymore here. And then we took him in the first in hospital, after the Freemason.
Do you think your experiences affected the way that you brought up George?
This is the question.
I don't know. I don't know. We've been a very protective parents, but I'm not so sure that's our bring up or from the Holocaust. That I'm not so sure. Maybe it's both of them. But
Do you think much about that time, or do you have dreams about the Holocaust, your experiences?
no, never. I had the dreams soon after the war, what we went through, yes, definitely, but not anymore, no.
George, I was talking with respect to your mother, with respect to your own profession as a child and adolescent psychiatrist. You've studied in a clinical manner the effects of life has on children. Your mother was just about a child when the war began. She was 12 years old. Through the eyes of what your knowledge as a professional is, how do you think that affected her? Her experiences have affected her?
I understand the question very clearly, but it's probably the limits of one's imagination to respond to such a question. If you were to ask me how a third party is affected, I could give you chapter and verse, I think, very easily. I think because of the emotional bonds and the history that we share, firstly, I'm not very comfortable to let my imagination just freely roam in this setting. I think because after we finish, there's still a relationship that we have. Having said that, I actually feel that my mother would probably have been affected more in the ages 15 and 16 when Budapest was actually invaded. And from the accounts that I've heard, the first few years, while their lives in Budapest was constricted, there was nothing very dramatic.
All right, George, what was happening to you when you were watching your mom's interview video?
Yes, I think at different times, the overall happening, I think, was times of quite a lot of headache, of tension, and in a surprising way, what happened was when I myself became emotional, I felt a lot of the headachy tension state relieved, and then I'd be in a much more relieved state till the next sort of wave of tension headache started, and then again it would be relieved by either laughter or if there was emotional reaction.
You're a good crawler, aren't you, hey? Oh, where did the paper go? Where did the paper go? Oh, that's it. You want that paper, don't you? You want that paper, don't you?
Okay. That was it. So that must have been your younger brother, that clip. I thought you were going to show a clip of yourself.
That was me before I went grey and old. That was in 1999, so 22 years ago.
Gotcha. Okay, what are some of the what were some of your takeaways from this? Or do we want to first debrief?
I just wonder if everyone could just signal if they're all right. In diving, we usually do that or that. And just to make sure that we're not assuming everyone's all right. You don't have to, yeah, just. Moshe, you're getting mostly everyone's all right?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. Okay, so the reason I take that precaution is because one of the most common reactions, and indeed, when I started this research, I was informed by a very, very well-known book at the time called Testimony, edited by Shoshana Fellman and Dory Laub in the early 1990s. And Shoshana Feldman was a professor of English at Yale. And Dr. Dory Laub, was an analyst and a psychiatrist, was one of the foremost child survivors in the US, who started the Yale Fortuna archive well before the Spielberg enterprise in the 1990s. And Shoshana Feldman, it was in fact her chapter that gave me the inspiration for this research, said that she showed some videos to her undergraduate English students as part of memoirs and biographies and so on. And to her surprise, the students, who were the brightest of the bright at Yale, became absolutely silent after watching the videos. And it turned out that they, in retrospect now, we would say they dissociated, they disconnected. So no matter how bright you are, how intellectual you are, this gets you at a lower, deeper level. And such trauma disconnects you from yourself. So in fact, reading that many times was when I then asked myself the question, if young people who are strangers to the person who's giving a testimony are impacted so strongly, I became curious. I said, I wonder what effect it would have on me as next of kin. And that's how, in fact, I set up this research project inspired by that. So from there, I learned the lesson very profoundly to take great care, because the power of such witnessing, such viewing, such engagement can be beyond one's own awareness. And this is where the diving metaphor comes in, that someone else, a buddy breather, a buddy diver, which we're all in a way each other's buddies tonight, requires one of us to sort of remind the other to take care. And that's why I sort of try to underline this process. And since when you and I spoke, Moshe, you wanted to know about process, this is one of those elemental safety processes.
Right. I'm actually wondering if any of the second generation Holocaust survivors on this call had any particular observations or felt in any way identified with your experience, and if there's anything they'd share. If anybody would like to, please raise your hand using the reactions button on the bottom right of the screen. And I will call on you, but I'm curious, Chana, if you or Chaya or Yetta or anybody else who might be a second generation survivor. I believe most of the people on the call, I'm going to guess, are third generation. And I'm also wondering if there's any fourth generation. Are we up to fourth generation survivors who are already entering the mental health field? I know that sounds crazy, but
Yes.
I don't know who's talking.
Sephora Schwartz. On
Sepho-
one side, I'm a fourth generation.
Okay, we're up to fourth generation. Okay,
Yeah.
amazing. Okay.
Could I just ask, is there any actual child survivors? That is the actual the survivor themselves?
I don't think we have anybody on. This is
No. Okay. So second, third, and 1/4. Thank you.
Okay. Any reactions from the second generation? Want to share? Chaya?
Hi, I have a little bit of different. My parents came in 1939 from Antwerp. My father did lose, and his siblings had all sorts of escape routes, but he did lose a sister and a brother and his mother in Auschwitz. So I did hear stories, and throughout my marriage, between my father-in-law telling his stories, he was Polish, and another family member telling her story. So I've heard these all, seen and thing. And I'm just hearing from my husband what he went through growing up with both his parents, who were Polish, survived many years in the camps with Auschwitz and a few others, and the Death March and all that, and the stories. And I think at this point, I'm a little numb So when I heard your mother talk, I did cry, but it doesn't, it's just repeated what I've heard. It did bring out emotion in me.
So George, when you talk about dissociating, would that mean that someone listening to it would just not feel at all? Would they be completely numb?
Well, I think, Chaya, thank you very much for sharing such personal experiences. And that, I think, to me, illustrates exactly the nuance, the complexity and the quickness that things can change, that as one's watching, again, using the diving metaphor, you can think you're just going to go down deeply or just stay at the surface. And before you know it, you're plummeted down to a depth you didn't even think you could get to. So you can be sort of floating in a sort of semi-numb aware state, and suddenly, without warning, as it were, like a sort of whirlpool under the ocean just drags you down, and suddenly you're lost for words and you find yourself overwhelmed with tears, or your heart racing, or going absolutely numb, going blank. And so these sudden changes are what I think are worth being cautious about and respecting very, very deeply, because these are the real reactions to real emotional extremes.
What were some of your own experiences, and what did you want us to see in watching that interview?
Well, firstly, Moshe, I think I should highlight what I was struck by when I set up this was how my naive aim was that I was going to discover the process of how trauma is transmitted. I was going to see something that by definition is the moment that my mother's trauma pops into me, and I was going to be hailed as someone who's discovered the transmission of trauma in these videos. Of course, that didn't happen. But what did happen at that time, which I didn't know about, was the recognition that my face went for a very long time, you could see, almost motionless, in contrast to my mother, who was actually quite animated. In fact, very animated. Her eyebrows would go up, she would smile, she would go into tears, she'd be on the edge of sobbing, she'd be puzzled. She was full of vitality, living. And I thought this would be the total other way around. I thought she would be the one who'd be monotone, almost frozen, just in a way repeating without much oomph the terrible things she went through, where she had this whole range of experiences and I went into statue mode, frozen mode. So at that time, I named my state a sort of exiled emotional state, that I didn't have connection, I didn't have access to my vitality. And I could contrast it with my mum. So this was rather a surprising observation. Now, many years later, I discovered that I was a product of my own training. And because my training was in more traditional psychoanalytic training, I was not exposed to the experiences of real trauma. I had 6 years of psychoanalysis 3 times a week in London. And that was under the auspices of a training analyst of the Winnicottian School, the independent school in the UK. But we didn't talk about real trauma in the 1980s and 90s, and to some degree even now. Many analysts or analytically informed therapists speak of psychic trauma. Now, psychic trauma is not regarded as the real thing, but the psychological representation of it. I didn't feel comfortable with that. And when I started to explore and research the experiences of trauma, I came across the construct of dissociation. And that, if those who are students of psychoanalysis, that was a forbidden concept in Freudian and post-Freudian psychoanalysis, they did not get dissociated. In fact, they didn't even get traumatized. The therapist would have countertransference to the patient's trauma, that is, feel with them, but not their real trauma. It was the patient alone who had the psychic reliving, and the therapist was one step sort of removed, even if they're very attuned and very sensitive. That was not my experience with my own clinical work, and certainly not with this video, because each time I watched it, I freaked out. And it took me many, many years. And even last night, I fell asleep watching it. Now, falling asleep, I could excuse or say, well, at 11 o'clock, it's a bit late, just don't be too hard on yourself. But it's also one of the known reactions of extreme exposure to stress. The classic fight, flight, freeze, and then the next one is faint. Fight, flight, freeze, faint. That's when your blood pressure and everything parasympathetic goes so far down. And I have learned that I actually get into dissociated states watching this. And even now, when you ask me my current reaction, Moshe, I was taking notes furiously as a way to make sure I'm still alert. So it's not scholarly as much as it is self-learning and self-regulating.
And you find that no matter how many times you watch this video, you'll still have a reaction to it, or what you call freaking out. That's not clinical, is that?
That's the clinical technical term. I freak out. Yeah. Yep.
And why is that? Why isn't that with so much exposure to it? You don't find that you've sort of...
Well, because as is often said, you never enter the same river the same way. So every time I re-enter the viewing, another new part of me gets exposed.
Mm-hmm.
Now, overall, this sounds like, God, this guy is a crazy shrink. Why would he expose himself to so much distress over the last 20 years? But let me just give the positive side to this, because what I've learned in trauma-informed therapy is I go through a cycle which is structured for safety. I go into a deep dive. Yes, I do expose myself to risk, but there's amazing positive things that I come up with. And what's the positive thing? When I enter, I know I'm going to feel cold and exposed to the currents. But if I'm safe enough, I have new experiences. Now, so the metaphor is when I go in, I get re-traumatized. But while I'm there, I learn to de-traumatize. And these are the processes that are going back and forth. The re-traumatization is in the service of de-traumatize. Then when I come up, I'm a different, altered internal processor, as it were.
And how do you de-traumatize while in the process?
Now, in the process, I just regulate the amount of trauma by breathing, or if I, like last night, fell asleep, my body regulates the limit. And then I wake up with a computer next to me thinking, oh, I must have dozed off. And yes, I did. So the body takes care of the safety at a certain level. And then this morning, I learn a lesson that I shouldn't have been starting this at 11 o'clock at night to watch it. I should have watched it in the afternoon when I had a bit more oomph. So one of the lessons you learn is about your own capacity, what your tolerance is. And as a therapist, of course, that's a basic quality that we should all have, because this happens as bread and butter to our daily therapeutic work.
Well, I'm thinking that there must be a correlation in the therapy room, even in this precise context. So if we're addressing somebody who's gone through a trauma such as this, how would we apply what you're describing to the therapy session or the therapy process?
Right. Well, that's what I've been doing for the last 20 years. So let me try and summarize that. And I have to say that what my primary theoretical background is, if your viewers and participants are aware of a man called Dr. Alan Shore, S-C-H-O-R-E. Now, he's really a pioneer and invented and coined the term 20 years ago in 2001 called relational trauma. That has revolutionized the understanding of the therapy of trauma, because prior to that, our teaching was that trauma is the event when, you know, a child is either positively traumatized by abuse or negatively traumatized by abandonment and lack of interaction. So these are the two extremes that result in what was called trauma. Relational trauma, on the other hand, is based from Alan's extraordinary work over the last 30 years. And so he and his wife, Judy, I've been friends with, and they're both my mentors for the last 20 years or so, have explained that there's a range that we can all tolerate, the zone of tolerance in a relationship. And then there are extremes at the upper end and the lower end, when based on understanding of how the so-called autonomic nervous system works, we get into either too much sympathetic drive, and then we get overstimulated, or too much parasympathetic, and we get understimulated. This is the fight, flight, freeze, faint, and for babies crying. Now, this is what actually is going on all the time in therapy, in all relationships, by the way. Let's forget for the moment therapy. But if you saw that last clip with the 3 mothers and babies, you saw that the middle one, the baby who was rolling over, got quite distressed when he couldn't find the drawing paper. Now, the third mother would have just probably remained silent because she turned the baby away from her, so there wasn't even facial contact there. Whereas the second mother leaned in and said, "Oh, you're looking for the, oh," and the baby just then kept on going and said, "Wow, all right, I've got a buddy breather here. I'm going to keep on marching on or rolling on and keep searching." So these were 2 very different styles of parenting. Now, that would have been called a potential relational trauma moment, which that mother was repairing as it was happening. She was cooing and she was down at that level, engaging, regulating. So as soon as the baby the toddler got a little distressed, the mother said, "Oh, you poor thing, oh, look at you." And then straight away, there was a down regulation. So that's what we're talking about in ordinary relationships. Relational trauma happens. The key question is, how, why, and when does a caregiver repair that trauma then and there or not? So it's nothing grand. You don't have to have massive traumas. It's these little things that accumulate and become the pattern of parenting. Now, in my case, because I know as a fact, my mother described how I was left in the baby carriage sometimes for hours, because at that stage in the late 40s, people didn't know that babies need interaction. So I created a bubble of dissociation that was never actually breached till I think I started watching these videos. And that's when I started my own video being the feedback. And that's when I realized that face that's frozen, mine, was in a natural state of dissociation. But no one ever told me I was dissociated. Clearly I was, but no one highlighted it, and I'm not blaming anyone. The knowledge wasn't in the culture of therapy. And so the last 20 years with Alan Shore's work as my theoretical substrate, as it were, I've realized that that's where I had my trauma transmission, which was dissociation that was not repaired. Now, the good news is I could repair it 40 years later, or 50 years later, or now it's 70 years later. It's still being repairable. So the paradigm, the understanding, the framework of how I make sense of the process of being traumatized and de-traumatized has changed radically with viewing these videos repeatedly.
Okay, well, that was a lot of profound information, and I hope that our viewers have some questions and clarifications. Let's take a question from Shifi, and please feel free if you didn't understand something George said or you want clarification, please raise your hand on the bottom. Sorry, I must have spent too much time at court this week, but raise your hand on the bottom right of the screen, and I will see it and call on you. Go ahead, Shifi.
Hi, so I am probably of the minority of people. I am I'm second generation American. My grandparents came over before the war. I had not heard a Holocaust story until after I was married.
Oh.
And one of my brother-in-laws shared with me what his family went through, and it was like eye-opening to me. I just grew up in this American bubble, never had any experience. I mean, I read the books, I read Anne Frank, I did my, my learning, but that was it. It was very not personal. It was really not a personal story for me. The last 4 years of my life have been quite different. I've been working with the Aleph Institute, which is an organization for, they provide services for incarcerated people and their families. And interestingly, it's an almost all Jewish, right? Interestingly, generational trauma has become like the thing we notice. So we know that there's the trauma of incarceration, but I would say almost 100% of the time we see generational trauma. The mom has trauma in her family, the dad has trauma in his family, and it goes back. And very often we see it coming from the Holocaust, which is fascinating to me. So I have many clients who are actually the children of Holocaust survivors. They have been traumatized, but they're not functioning the way you are. They're not functioning. And they were not the kind of parents. Yeah, their parents were, the ones that were up a whole night screaming, hiding in closets. They describe a childhood that is like horrific. They went through trauma that was not at all repaired. And then they had children. And similarly, they kind of gave what they got. They didn't have anything more to give. And their children also experienced trauma and also without repair. And then a lot of them ended up with addiction and in prison. So it's a fascinating space. And I think that has sensitized me, being exposed, like you say, vicariously through my clients. When I was watching the video, I was moved to tears. I was struck by how frozen you were. It was a fascinating experience for me, almost like a newer experience for me to bear witness and to feel it in a way that I don't think I would have 4 or 5 years ago.
Interesting.
Thank you very much, Shifi. That's very, very moving, profound, and creative insights, if I might say. And I love your phrase, you give what you get. And that happens on a big scale where there's actually physical violence in the childhood of some of the incarcerated people, or indeed some who are not incarcerated, but then become perpetuators of violence within domestic settings. Or it happens on the micro level, where it's not necessarily physical positive violence, but physical negative. That is the abandonment or the neglect or the inappropriate attunement. Yeah. So these are the whole range, and the population who's incarcerated are at the end of very tragic stories where they've never had the space to be thought about by anyone as being traumatized. That's just not in that spatial awareness of the incarcerating system. And indeed, the whole legal system only in the last 30 or so years has offered trauma as a mitigating dimension, because it was introduced, as you know, within the mental health field in the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, only in 1980 in the context of the returning Vietnam veterans. Up till then, war veterans, Holocaust survivors and so on were not actually known to be traumatized.
Right.
The history of trauma is a fascinating story going back to the First World War. Shell shock was not trauma, it was shell shock. Second World War, it was war neurosis. It was a neurotic condition. So it was only since 1980, that's the last 41 years, that's relatively recent in the history of mankind, to label trauma experience as traumatic.
Okay, let's take another question from Dina. Dina is actually a second generation Holocaust survivor. Go ahead, Dina.
You hear me?
Loud and clear.
Yes, I am a second generation survivor. My father was in Auschwitz, and I'm an oldest, and he died when I was 10. So the only thing I know about my father's family is nothing. Okay, my mother was married to him for 10 years, and she knows nothing. So there was silence. I had one uncle that survived, and he also did not speak. There were 9 kids there, 7 died, and the parents died as well. So there was nothing. So, so I had the trauma of a father who did not speak, and then he got sick with cancer when I was 8 and died when I was 10. My mother ran away from Europe in 1939, and nobody in her immediate family died, but she was left with a lot of anxieties. So my thing with that was that I was going to give my kids and my family something different, because I did not want them to have that. And all, to be perfectly frank, still made mistakes, which, you know, Baruch Hashem, I realize, and I've tried to work through them, but that is what I felt what trauma does, that it does a lot of damage on the hood that you don't even realize that that was the damage it did, because you think by making sure not to give that damage, you're not damaging. Does that make sense?
It makes absolute sense, absolutely total sense, yes.
So that was, that is my mother is still alive, and I have a lot of compassion for her. But she was definitely traumatized from the running away and from her father trying to get the rest of his family out with visas because he had money and he couldn't. And so they died, and she saw and experienced all that. She was very young. She was 2 years old when she left. She's 83 years old now. And yeah, so that was my experience with being the child of a Holocaust. Both of them are actually, but one was in Auschwitz. And like I said, I don't know much, except for the fact that I'm a Bas Kayin. My father was a Kayin, and he was one of 9, but I don't really know much else. And there was a silence.
What is the percent that a person is actually aware? You know, we only know ourselves the way we are. We don't know ourselves the way we could have been, or what we're sort of not. What percent of people is blind? You know, when all of us say we're going to do what our parents didn't do, or we're going to raise our children differently than we were raised in this area or this variable. How blind are people to the actual experiences that they reenact?
I think that the general understanding of awareness, conscious awareness, I think most researchers and clinicians and students of the field would say that at best we're fully aware of maybe 10% of ourselves. Now that may sound bizarre, but it's been shown repeatedly that there is so much in our non-conscious and pre-conscious, and I have to then qualify it, there's so much that we know that isn't even in words. That is the intuitive knowledge, the implicit knowledge. And so when we come to the question of parenting and styles of parenting, the one thing we can say that we know is what our intention is. As Dina, you said that one of your intentions was to do, as it were, almost the opposite of what happened to you. Now, that may be the sort of conscious, aware intention. But the other thing that we have to keep in mind is that we've got a lot of intuitive, implicit ways of being human, which, by the way, we all make mistakes. That's just, if anyone doesn't, then they're angels. And I don't know if angels have therapy or not, but mortals certainly require it at times.
They say that 90% of people make mistakes. The other 10% are liars.
They're not angels?
They're liars.
They're liars. Okay.
Because they are making mistakes. They're just lying about it.
So the angelic interpretation is a sort of a fudging it.
Right. Exactly.
Okay. Right. So we're getting real here. Now, the point is that it's not about whether we do or don't make mistakes or even acknowledge it or lie about it, but whether we do something about it differently the next time. Children are incredibly forgiving. And in therapy, we make mistakes all the time. I mean, that's what therapy is actually about, by repairing mistakes that we make. We think we're doing some very clever things in interpretation and reframing and what else. But often what we do is we repair the mistakes that are being relived or enacted. And that's really what parenting is about as well. So there's no blueprint for correct, good parenting. And Donald Winnicott famously coined the phrase of the good enough parent, the good enough mother. And that's all we can hope for and strive for. And again, Donald Winnicott used a very elegant phrase, to provide a facilitating environment. He didn't use about values, a good environment or a bad. He wasn't a values-based therapist. Clearly he was, but that wasn't, it wasn't a morally dictated therapy. It was a matching, attunement, and being at one with the baby or the child or the adolescent. And the idea there is to match in a good enough way that the child, and each child in a family's got a different endowment. So the same parenting will not work for the next one. And the first will have a different experience to the second child because the second's already got a sibling. The third has got two siblings. By the fourth or the fifth or the sixth, parents are almost a bit irrelevant because the eldest one is much more attuned. I shouldn't say irrelevant, but you get what I mean, that the centrality of the mother and the father as organizing the mind of the firstborn is much greater than the second, third, and subsequent child. And so therefore, there's a different experience subjectively of each child's experience, even of the parent, and in turn, each child's experience of the sibling. So two may be the favorite friends, the third and fourth may say they're terrible, the fifth and sixth say they're the wonderful, and the third and fourth are terrible. I mean, because I use these extremes because children talk in extremes. Later on, of course, everyone starts to recognize we're just human, but that takes sometimes a long time.
And by the way, the parents aren't only the facilitators of the attachment, so to say, between the parent and child, but they're also facilitators of the overall atmosphere and culture between the children themselves, among the children.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Let's take a comment from Peril. Peril, go ahead.
Sorry?
We have a question or comment from Peril.
Yes.
Right. I'm actually torn between discussing two things. One is my personal experience as a second generation escapee from Europe, which left me very traumatized, even though my father only shared miraculous stories. He never gave over any kind of frightening information. Later on, I read things from and heard interviews, and I really got a better sense of how terrifying it was. But despite the fact that my father was always talking about all the miracles and how wonderful, like God saved the family from so many different things, I still felt so deeply touched and, by the material, just by the idea of the Holocaust, that it's hard for me to read books. Like, I'm one of these people, I save it for Tisha B'Av. Otherwise, I do not read any of this stuff. It really dysregulates me. What do you think that is? Although you did mention something about a child absorbing from the parent. I'm wondering if that's something I just absorbed without actually hearing anything about it. Is that feasible?
Well, 100%, Peril. I think when you emphasized that your father's sort of heroic stories were the narratives that you hear. But when you hear that with a certain, I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with the word prosody. Prosody is the sound that the voice and the vocabulary makes.
Right.
If someone's very enthusiastic and expansive about their miraculousness, then the music goes into high pitch. The prosody gets to be registered up there, and there isn't a balanced sort of waveform to it. And so what you register is its counter music. It's like the heaviness that's never addressed. And there is no words for those heavinesses. And therefore you have absorbed an incredible amount of non-verbal communication.
Wow, that's fascinating. Yeah. I have another question, but I don't want to take up too much time. It's about a client. Should I save it for later, Moshe, if there's time?
We can do that. We can do that. We have another couple of questions. So just raise your hand again so we can see you there. Let's go to Yetta. Go ahead, Yetta.
Okay. Just to talk about my experience to some extent, I'm a child of Holocaust survivors, both from Poland. This was my identity. Someone once asked me how I described myself, and I said I'm a child of Holocaust survivors. That's who I was, and that's what informed my life and my life decisions. And growing up, I was exposed to it in different ways. My parents talked very little about it. I overheard things when they were together with their friends and so on. But my father spoke almost not at all. He lost a wife and a baby. My mother spoke a little bit more. But I always felt, growing up, I knew it was my responsibility, unspoken, to give my parents nachas. I have a younger sister who never married and had children. And somehow I knew that back then. I can't say how, don't know. But what's interesting is I had a patient many years ago who was also a child of Holocaust survivors. She was kind of disturbed on her own, but one day she talked about her bad marriage and how she realized shortly after she'd gotten married that it was not going to be good and it was not good. And I just said, so why did you stay? And when she said, because I had to give my parents nachas, I had nothing to say to her. Because I understood that. That was the end of that. So yeah, I think we're traumatized without realizing it, without understanding. My parents were not affectionate when my sister and I were growing up, and I realized at some point they were shell-shocked. They couldn't do it because with my children, they were very warm and affectionate.
Yeah.
By that point, they were ready to do that. And as far as reading, when I was young, I was able to read things. As I got older, it became harder and harder, and I stopped reading things I couldn't. Became too emotional. I recently read Sarah Yocheved Ratcliffe's book on the reincarnation of souls of children from the Holocaust. It just came out. There were times when I had to put it down. I couldn't read it. It was too difficult. That's just my experience.
Yetta, thank you very much indeed. And I think you've spoken and given words to an experience so many of us either have heard or live without articulating that we are there as the providers of nachas, without even being aware that's what we're doing. Now, in psychological terms, there's a term called the parentified child, where there's a reversal of roles and functions, where out of the natural sensitivity and empathy that all babies are born with, they turn around that empathy where there's a lacking, as it were, in the parents because they're numbed, they're in shell shock or is dissociated, and they then, without any awareness, give over that empathy to their care, the parents' care, hence the parentified child. Now, the downside of that is that unless you can go through your whole life with that sort of model of relating, there comes a crisis point somewhere in the midlife or some phase of life where it doesn't work anymore. And so when your patient comes to you and you then have this total identification, of course, you're speechless. You do not even have the literacy, as it were, to find the necessary word, because we are living that state. So what we're doing tonight is, in fact, naming it, and you've helped me, and I thank you very much, for increasing my trauma literacy to link the parentified child me to that process of traumatization. Because I also, at the moment, I'm in the carer's role for my, bless her, 94-year-old mum who's in respite care. And one of the deep struggles I have, when now I talk to my therapist, now, in fact, I've got an appointment after this session, where I'll bring up some of the lessons I'm learning, is that I'm trying to negotiate my residual parentified obligations towards her at the same time as maintaining my obligations for myself to keep myself as the carer healthy, not to be available just for her, but for my own sake. That it is absolutely legitimate as a process to look after yourself as a carer, not only for the cared for person, be that a child, a sibling, a parent, or a relative. That the human condition is that we're entitled to regulate our self-care. Now, a parentified child who's devoted to bringing nachas to the world can't do that. And just to go back to the previous exchange we had about a father who is expansive in the heroics, sometimes that is the necessary way to cope with getting through life. It may not be appropriate for the partner or the offspring because it doesn't resonate with their need for heroics. Sometimes we just need ordinariness and the acknowledgement that trauma is called trauma. And it's, as my mother says, it's overwhelming. But I'll just say a little anecdote because I just want to come out from the very deep place. Yetta, was that enough response to your experience?
Yes, I just wanted to make one comment when I said earlier that my parents were shell-shocked and didn't show physical
intimacy, perhaps.
no, affection, thank you. That speaking for myself, I absolutely, there was no doubt in my mind that I was loved. I felt very much loved.
Yeah.
There was no question. I would hear my mother talk about my sister and myself as her diamonds and jewels.
Yeah.
That was all we needed to hear. So that just wanted to add.
Beautiful.
Can we take a question from Tzipora? Go ahead. Yeah, unmute.
Yeah. I resonate a little bit with what Pearl was saying of how like she shuns away from, you know, reading and engaging with Holocaust material. I'm like more of a third generation. I would say like my grandfather is both got out before the war, but they've experienced a little bit of it. They did tell a few stories, but I think more of it, my experience with it was as a culture, like in school and just in the community, they were always showing us tons and tons of videos. Maybe I experienced it, maybe I was a little too young to be viewing such graphic things, that it had quite an effect on me. I would say I probably was very traumatized. I used to go to sleep like thinking that the Nazis were coming to take me, like probably at around like age 9. I was afraid to take showers. I would sleep, I think I would like calculate, I would like sleep with my shoes on. If like they came in the middle of the night, then like I would be able to like run out and have my shoes with me. Which was like, it was like, I kind of didn't have that understanding of like, that was then and this is now. And I'm just curious where that all really might have came from. Like my grandparents talked about it a bit, but it was more of like these, like the videos and the graphics and all that around. I don't know if anybody else has experienced such things.
Well, yeah, can I just comment, Sapporo? I certainly have, and I'm still very drawn to watching these things. I've watched dozens of interviews, either from Shoah or from other places, dozens of documentaries. I'm very drawn to watching these things, and I become very immersed when I watch them. I think besides, we're discussing a lot of intergenerational, which we hardly even discussed, but maybe we'll have to do that in part 2, George.
Yes, I
Okay,
hear what you're saying, Moshe. I do
okay,
hear.
part 2. So, but I, besides that, I think what Zipporah is also referring to is very cultural and communal trauma, and related to what she's saying is certain phenomena such as Jews protecting Jews, Jews being suspicious of non-Jews entering their homes. I work in a community where the particular part, some of the particular work that I do has non-Jewish or Gentile case managers entering the homes of Jewish homes or Orthodox homes, and there's a lot of suspicion. They're out to get us. They're going to call protective services, and in general, Jews protecting Jews, even when they may be doing things wrong or inappropriate. A lot of protection that very clearly, if you read some of the documentaries or memoirs of people's Holocaust experiences, they had to protect each other. My wife's grandparents were saved because one of them was on top of the potato truck and threw a potato down, so the other one had a potato to eat. That's just the way things were. And I think that that's where a lot of the intergenerational communal repercussions lie very much. I had to give a cultural competency training, and this is one of the things I actually spoke about. That it's going to take time for an Orthodox family to gain the trust of a non-Jewish case manager who's walking into their home.
I think these are very, very profound issues that we have heard about and know about. And in my experience, they start to make sense really when we put on the lens of the reality of trauma dissociation. And Tzipora, you raised the question of that was then, this is now. How can it be that you're terrified of taking showers and getting ready with the shoes and so on? Well, trauma knows no time. It's the body that remembers, not the mind. And so if you had visual images of showers, then it's not about then and now, it's about a shower is the trigger. If you saw images of homes being invaded in the middle of the night, then it's not then or now, it's the trigger is the middle of the night, because your body is remembering a scene visually.
And also there's like the child development in there, right? A child's mind.
I'm sorry?
And the child's mind, even more so.
Well, the child's mind is a sponge. It is absolutely soaking up by osmosis and by methods of what are called identification and mirroring and various mechanisms and processes. But that is how a child's mind is shaped. And that is the core work we do in therapy to tune into how it was shaped. That's when we take a history and find a developmental story. We make a formulation, and then we offer intervention by allowing ourselves to deep dive to those depths with the child or adult patient. And in that process, we become traumatized through enactment. And I just might mention a lesson that I learned from my mum about vicarious trauma, because we talked about that at the very beginning, and I'm mindful we're coming close to the end. So just to give acknowledgement to my co-worker, my teacher, Halasz, my mum. Many years ago, I said to her, I'm going to give a lecture, and she said, you know, very nice, kol hakavod, mazel tov, and all that. What's it about? And because we speak in Hungarian, I didn't know the word for vicarious trauma. And I tried to explain it to her, and I went as follows. I said, well, look, it's a sort of thing where if you're very upset or you're very happy, then if I'm close to you and I listen to you, I could get very upset by your upset, or I could get very happy by your happiness. And there's something like that that happens in trauma, and that's what I'm going to give a talk on. And my mother was sort of listening, what I thought was a bit indulgently, but you know, I thought, oh well, I hope she gets what I'm talking about. And after a moment, she said, "So is that like passive smoking, that you smoke, inhale, and you can get at risk for cancer and so on?" And I thought, wow, that's an amazing insight. But of course, I didn't want to give her too big a head. I said, yeah, that's quite an accurate sort of story, you know, quite good, in fact. And I said, you know, I might use it. So she said, well, why do you then have to give a whole hour talk? Just tell them it's like passive smoking. I said, well, that's another good point. I don't know why I have to give a talk. But you're right, I could just say at the start, like, vicarious trauma is like passive smoking, goodbye. But I don't think that's what I'm being invited to do. So she said, all right, do what you have to do, but to me it's passive smoking, and goodbye.
Do you think your mother might want to consider going to, you know, for an MSW or a psychology degree?
Well, Moshe, you well may ask, because a number of people said, is your mother ever giving lectures? Because maybe we should go to hers rather than yours.
Well, would your mother come on the show?
That's one of the reasons I asked you if this is recorded, and you said very kindly it is. I will show it to her. And
okay, and we'll let her decide.
If you extend an invitation, then we could set up something where she could give the next one.
Okay, well, let's discuss. Let's go to Heather. I know we're a little over time, but we can't get enough. So go, Heather.
Thank you, Moshe. So two comments. One is I'm a child of Holocaust survivors, both from Poland. My mother spent 5 years in a Lodz ghetto, and the remainder of the war in Auschwitz-Birkenau. So basically, she experienced every trauma through an expansive time frame. And my father was sent to a Siberian labor camp. Can we weigh the value of the intensity of the trauma? I mean, it's tough there. But what I'm really thinking about is being caught in the middle between parents who have different attachment styles and ways of communicating them. So my mother was very withdrawn and avoidant, not disorganized, but just like dispassionate or somewhat dissociative. And my father was very anxious and very needy. So there was this like rubber band effect of like, who needs more caregiving, who's right, you know. It was just this sort of conundrum of how a child should be with parents who've had contrasting trauma histories that have a shared collective foundation. And to move into the next second part is, I realized until I was about 16 or 17, thereabout, my all my friends were children of survivors. I couldn't relate. I mean, it was, I guess, on some kind of meta unconscious level. It was like, if from an adolescent development perspective, it's like, which group do you associate with? So it wasn't the artistic kids or this studious kids, it were children of survivors. And I guess that's thinking about caregiving or being parentified, is perhaps that's where we got our in-group support from like-minded others.
I think, thank you, Heather, you've raised one of the most profound experiences for restoring health in traumatized families is the degree to which we find a peer group that can sustain and support our own development. And that happens in normal adolescent development, by the way, and even before, that the best predictor for later good adjustment in adulthood is the availability of a peer group relationship in childhood and adolescent. Now, you raised the very critical point that in adolescence, where you have a background of extremes, in one way, if I may say it like this without in any way trying to offend, but that is the better option than having had two parents of one extreme or the other, to have both, because you at least had a contrast.
A balance, so to speak.
Well, if you could find it, you could then say that's called the balance, because you had models of both extremes. If a child has only one model, that is called normal, and then anything else they would regard themselves as bizarre. Whereas if you have, although I would never recommend such extreme experiences, but I hope you understand what I'm saying, in that context, it is the preferred background. And then you bring your own giftedness and talents and temperament to, as you say, the possibility of choosing in adolescence which peer group that you'd like to resonate with most. And you find meaning and sustenance with them.
Yeah, it was also from a nonverbal perspective. It was just this like this nonverbal meta language that transcended. We didn't have to explain the bizarrities or the, it was us and it was them. And that's kind of where we felt safe with each other.
I think that's the critical point. There's a sort of kinship in understanding without explaining.
Mm.
And that kinship is way beyond words, and it's centered on a safety, as you say, yes.
Mm. Thank you.
Could we take one last question from Parul, a follow-up about a client? I know it's getting a little late. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm currently treating a young woman who is the child of, actually the grandchild of Holocaust survivors from both sides. And, a lot of attachment wounds. She was emotionally neglected. And she came into my office basically without the language to say so, saying that she'd like to stop the generational trauma. So one thing that we actually discussed today in session is that when her baby cries or whines a lot, she gets very dysregulated. She gets very emotional. She ends up, frustration and anger up to a certain point is natural, but crying and really seeming very distressed. What would you attribute that to? And, where would you go with that?
How many seconds do I have to respond?
Yeah, that sounds like a loaded question.
Big one. Maybe yeah.
Basically the issue here is the bringing awareness that she's moving outside of this zone that she can tolerate, which is tremendous health. Mm-hmm. You have to really commend her on her courage that she's bringing this to the attention of your relationship, because the hardest thing is to acknowledge there's a difficulty with coping. And so you've got a tremendous degree of trust already built in that she's entrusting her mother-child relationship at this very, very delicate level. And once you can acknowledge that you appreciate her awareness, she's going to say that you've got it, you understand. Then you can work out with her, and you can then in your own mind create enough diving space to think, what is it that she would like to do with you about it?
Mm-hmm.
To invite her to remain empowered.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Because she's very, very competent to be seeking you out as a therapist. You're very sensitive to have tuned in enough. And this is the trust that usually takes so long to build. You've got it there.
Mm-hmm.
So then use that and keep her empowered. Invite her to come with suggestions. And then you become the trauma-informed master diver, as it were, as you go down to deep levels. But first ask what she would like.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's interesting. That's a good point. Thank you.
Okay.
She's the expert of her child.
Well, the one thing we didn't fully cover, tonight, which I hope for part 2, is the intergenerational trauma, which means how is this getting carried down to the next generation? From we were in particular talking about Holocaust survivors, but that wasn't necessarily the topic. I'm sure there's many, many other forms of intergenerational trauma outside the world of Holocaust. And I'm wondering if at some point we could continue the conversation to look at how many generations will this does this perpetuate typically, ordinarily? Does it sort of obliterate itself, or does it stay forever? What does that mean about us, up to Sinai? Or what does it mean about us as for those of us who are Jewish on this program? What does that mean about us going all the way up to who knows how far back, and how much of us has remained with us from then? And then the more local traumas. What does that mean in terms of parents to child to grandchild to great grandchild, when the grandparents are still when the trauma survivor is still alive, and then after they're gone, how far down does that go? And then how we might treat something like that in therapy. So this is a way broader and more exciting topic than I allowed a lot of time for.
Well, one of the participants actually raised the issue of Tisha B'Av.
Yes.
I mean, that's the perfect example.
How that's still with us.
Yeah.
That's quite a long time ago. Okay. Well, George, it's been such an honor and pleasure having you on. You held the crowd so nicely, and they couldn't seem to get enough. So I really appreciate you joining us and participating. I feel like it's a taste of something, and I hope there's more to come. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon or evening. And go play some tennis for us in the warm spring summer heat. Is it the first day of spring or something? What do you have now? First day of summer?
No, we're fully into summer from the
fully into summer.
Yes.
Could you believe
it? Could
I
just say thank you to everyone who's participated, and especially those who had the courage to bring up very, very personal family, individual, and professional experiences. It takes a lot of courage to speak and share. So I really value the trust that you entrusted me and us with, Moshe. Thank you.
Well, thank you again, and have a great day. And good night, everybody. We'll see you next week.